In the late afternoon, as I was organizing my bedroom, I suddenly heard the door creak behind me. I spun around and there was Alden standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the object in my hands. My heart seemed to stop. How should I express this? The object was anything but innocent. It was a large, brightly colored toy, impossible to ignore in any reasonable conversation. I had taken it out from the drawer to clean behind the cabinet, not giving it much thought. I had assumed the door was locked. Alden, my 23-year-old stepson, was not expected to be home yet. He worked at a nearby brewery and typically spent his evenings socializing with friends after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lean, his black hair falling into his amused blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his tone switching between curious and playful, causing me to blush deeply. I quickly dropped the toy as though it had burned me, grabbing the nearest item, a throw pillow, to hide it. "It's none of your business," I muttered, feeling my throat tighten. He remained unfazed, leaning against the doorframe, his curiosity growing. "You don't need to be embarrassed," he said with a slight laugh. I had never encountered something like this before. It made me wish I could disappear. The boldness of this person standing there was astonishing, so calm, so unbothered, as my life seemed to unravel. I forced a laugh, eager to ease the tension. Alden, his expression turning serious, said, "Mind your own business. Your presence here is unnecessary." Yet he stayed put for a while. A heavy silence enveloped us, almost unbearable. He no longer looked at the pillow I was holding, his attention now focused entirely on me. His gaze was intense, unlike the usual relaxed or joking look I was used to. It lingered, probing, as though he had peeled back the layer of the person I presented to him and discovered someone completely different. I felt a strange warmth deep in my chest, followed by a sharp pang of guilt. This was wrong, I told myself. I was his stepmother, for heaven's sake. I was married to his father. I broke the silence. Alden only shrugged, raising his hands in mock surrender, before casually remarking, "I'm just saying," before leaving. But before he walked out, he cast one final glance at me, his look making my already conflicted thoughts swirl. When the door shut behind him, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the pillow pressed tightly to my chest, my heart racing. I couldn't return the toy to the drawer. An invisible shift had taken place in the space between us, and though I tried to ignore it, I knew I would never see Alden the same way again. Throughout the evening, the moment replayed in my mind. I went through the motions, cooking dinner, sorting laundry, sitting with Victor as he watched old westerns on TV, but Alden's amused smile and the unsettling glint in his eyes stayed with me. Victor hardly noticed my distraction, engrossed in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, and crosswords, since his retirement. I had no resentment toward him for it. That would be too simple. Yet, sometimes I felt more like a caregiver than a wife. I briefly noticed Alden's silhouette as he passed by his room down the hall, the faint hum of music from behind his door. The deep bass echoed through the quiet house, and my heart inexplicably skipped a beat. I turned my attention back to Victor, who had fallen asleep in his recliner, his chin dropped to his chest. The TV buzzed on, and I considered waking him, but questioned the point. I stood up and wandered into the kitchen for some quiet time, but it was short-lived. Alden came in, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled as if he had run his hands through it. "Hey," he greeted casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, keeping my tone light. He smiled, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding. You know, it's not always easy living here." His comment made me stop. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged, but there was something serious in his expression. "It's nothing. Just being back here, I guess. I feel like I don't quite belong anymore." I softened. Despite everything, I felt a surge of maternal instinct. "It's just temporary, Alden. You'll figure it out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet." "Thanks," he said quietly. "I appreciate that." For a moment, we stood in silence. The kitchen seemed smaller somehow, the space between us shrinking, even though neither of us moved. His gaze lingered on mine, and I felt that same warmth in my chest again. I cleared my throat and began wiping the counter, trying to break the spell that seemed to be forming. But Alden wasn't done. "About earlier," he started, his tone turning playful again. You don't have to be embarrassed, you know? I mean, we're all human, right? My hand froze as I wiped the counter, and I turned to him. Alden, let's not talk about that. It was an accident, and it's not something we need to discuss again. Okay, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender, but his smile had a teasing edge that made my stomach twist. He walked past me, close enough that I caught a faint whiff of his scent. I didn't turn around, but for a brief moment, I could sense his presence behind me before he finally left the kitchen that night. As I lay in bed beside Victor, my thoughts raced. What was happening to me? To us? To this house? I had always been able to establish clear boundaries that no one should cross, but Alden had a way of blurring those lines, even unintentionally. The most troubling part was that I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The following morning, I tried to keep things normal. I made breakfast as usual: eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor, a smoothie for myself. Alden was the last one to come into the kitchen, as per usual, his hair still damp from his shower. He greeted Victor with a casual morning, and me with a warm smile that caused my heart to race. The three of us sat at the table, the sound of silverware clinking and snippets of conversation filling the air, but beneath it all, there was an undeniable tension. Every time Alden's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or refilled coffee, it felt intentional. I noticed him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Of course, Victor didn't pick up on any of it. After breakfast, Alden offered to help me clean up. Normally, he would have disappeared into his room or gone out with friends, so his offer surprised me. You don't have to, I said, stacking the plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, already grabbing a dish towel. We worked in silence for a while, but the air between us felt charged. At one point, I reached for a glass just as he did, and our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away immediately. You're different, he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. What do you mean? I asked, my throat dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. You don't act like other women your age. I nervously laughed, stepping back to create some space. Well, that's flattering, I said. It's not just that, he continued, his tone now serious. You're real. You actually listen. You see people. The sincerity in his voice threw me off balance. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I could feel his presence behind me again. My heart raced once more, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could sort through my emotions, Victor's voice called from the living room. Melina, where's my crossword book? The moment was broken, and Alden stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. I'll let you get back to him, he said, his voice light once again as he walked away. I felt a mix of relief and longing. I knew I was playing with fire, but a part of me couldn't resist reaching for the heat. That afternoon, I kept myself busy with errands, anything to distract myself. But when I returned home, I found Alden sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. He seemed deep in thought, a stark contrast to the confident young man I was used to seeing. I approached and spoke softly, and he looked up, offering a small smile. Hey, is everything okay? He asked. He hesitated before responding. Yeah, just thinking about life, I guess. Where I'm headed, where I should be headed. I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance, but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. You're young, Alden. You don't need to have it all figured out just yet, I said. He looked at the yard, lost in thought, before speaking again. Do you ever feel like you're meant for something different? Like you're trapped in the wrong story? His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be fine, but the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. Instead, I placed my hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. You're not trapped, I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a brief moment, he placed his hand over mine, and the gesture felt unbelievably intimate. I quickly pulled away, but it was too late. Another boundary had been crossed, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it. That evening, the sky darkened with an approaching storm, and the air felt heavy, as though the world was waiting for something to unfold. Victor had gone to bed early, complaining of a sore shoulder, and I settled into the living room with a book in hand. But I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the one growing within me, something restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. Alden was in the kitchen, and I could hear the fridge opening and closing. Then the faint sound of glass clinking as he poured himself a drink. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "Care for one?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late," I replied. "Well, maybe tonight's an exception," he said, grinning as he handed me a glass without waiting for an answer. I hesitated, but took the cool glass, feeling it against my palm. Alden sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs casually. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow on his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble on his chin. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting." He smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while we sat in silence, the storm outside growing louder. But then he spoke again, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him warily. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it as though he were gathering his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question startled me, eerily similar to the one he had asked earlier on the porch. But now there was a different weight to it. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice quieter than I had intended. He looked up, meeting my gaze. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." I felt my cheeks burn and quickly turned away, placing my glass on the coffee table. "Alden, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not? It's the truth." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unsaid emotions. I suddenly stood up, feeling the need for some space between us. "I think it's time to call it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze. But just as I was about to leave the room, the power cut out. The instant darkness was disorienting, and I froze mid-step. "It's just the storm," Alden said in a calm voice. I heard him move, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. "Hold on, I'll get a flashlight," he added, coming closer. As he passed by, his hand brushed mine in the dark, and I took a sharp breath. "Sorry," he murmured, but his hand didn't withdraw. It stayed warm against mine, and the air around us seemed to change. I couldn't move, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. "Melina," he whispered softly. I turned towards him, even though I couldn't see him in the darkness. But his presence, his warmth, and his steady breath were clear. Then his hand gently slid up to my wrist, holding it tenderly. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice quivering. "I know," he replied, not letting go. The first flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second, and in that brief moment, I saw his face, earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. Then he kissed me. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands clutching his shirt as if he were the only steady thing in a spinning world. When the lights flickered back on and we broke apart, both of us were breathless, the reality of what had just happened crashing into me like a wave. I stepped back, my hands shaking. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head. Alden didn't argue. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said quietly. But the damage had been done. The following days passed in a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Alden as much as I could, throwing myself into chores and errands to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feel of his lips on mine or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, while folding laundry in the guest room, Alden appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he insisted, stepping into the room and shutting the door behind him. I sighed, putting the laundry down and finally meeting his gaze. "Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't understand. If Victor ever found out—" "He won't," Alden interrupted. "And even if he did, do you think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words stung, partly because they were true, but that didn't make them right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising. "It's about us. About the fact that whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible." Alden took a step closer, his eyes fixed on mine. Why? Because you're scared of what people might think, or because you're scared of what you might think? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Melina's voice softened. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you, and I don't think you do either. Tears welled up in my eyes and I looked away. I don't understand, I whispered. Then explain it to me, he said, his tone pleading. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the turmoil inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of Victor's breathing beside me. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't untangle. Eventually, I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would calm me. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Alden's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, as if he'd been waiting for me. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to speak. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence heavy between us. Then, without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us, it wasn't going away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there was no storm to blame, no flickering light to hide behind. This time, it was intentional. It started in the laundry room of all places. I was pulling warm towels from the dryer, the rhythmic task of folding them offering some semblance of escape. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. Always working, Alden's voice said, light, but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. Someone has to, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He laughed softly. Fair enough, but don't you ever get tired of it? Tired of taking care of everything? Taking care of everyone? When's the last time someone took care of you? His words cut through me like a knife. I spun around, clutching a folded towel to my chest like it was a protective shield. Alden, I said, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having. Why not? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe, appearing completely relaxed and unconcerned. But his eyes told a different story, sharp, searching, and incredibly focused on me. Because, I faltered, it's not appropriate. He repeated the word, almost testing it. But that's not the same as being honest, is it? I wanted to argue, to shut him down before he could make things worse, but before I could react, he stepped closer, closing the gap between us. You don't have to pretend with me, Melina, he said softly. I see you. I see how you manage this house, keeping everything together while everyone else takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself? My throat tightened, and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter against my hips. Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop. He reached out, and his hand brushed against mine. It was a simple, small gesture, but it felt as if the ground beneath me was shifting. Tell me you don't feel it too, he whispered. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out because I couldn't lie to him or myself. Then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time, I didn't pull away. The days that followed blurred into stolen moments and whispered secrets. We tried to be careful, or at least we thought we were. Alden was good at finding excuses to stay near me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first, it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden, but the reality of our situation started to weigh heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last, knew it was just a matter of time before everything fell apart. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Alden came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I tensed, glancing toward the doorway to check for anyone. Alden, we'd be caught any second, I hissed, trying to pull away. He's at the hardware store, Alden said calmly. But I couldn't calm myself. The paranoia gnawed at me. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Bethany, our inquisitive neighbor, waved from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. We need to talk, I said, turning to face Alden. About what? He asked, his expression unreadable. About this. About us. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw anger flash in his eyes. What about us? He asked. This has to stop. I said, forcing the words out. It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor. Fair to me, then? Alden retorted, his voice rising. You're so focused on him that you don't even think about what you want. What I want doesn't matter, I snapped. It's not about me, Alden shot back. You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve someone who sees your worth. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later when Victor invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner. I did my best to be the perfect hostess, but Bethany's sharp gaze never seemed to leave me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Bethany cornered me. You've been awfully distracted lately, she remarked casually, though her eyes were anything but casual. Just busy, I replied, forcing a smile. You know how it is. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Does Victor know? I froze, my heart pounding. No, I whispered. Whatever's going on with you and Alden, she said, her tone unreadable. Just be careful, Melina. Secrets have a way of coming out. That night, as I lay in bed, her words played over and over in my mind. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Alden found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. You're avoiding me, he said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. I'm trying to protect us, I replied, not looking up. Protect us from what? He asked, stepping closer. From this, I said, standing up and wiping my hands on my jeans. Bethany knows, Alden. She knows. He frowned, his expression darkening. How could she know? He asked. I don't know, but she does, I said, my voice rising. And if she tells Victor? He asked. She won't, he said firmly. You don't know that, I snapped. You don't understand how dangerous this is. Alden grabbed my hand, his grip firm but not painful. What I understand, he said, is that I don't want to lose you. His raw emotion caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. You won't, I whispered finally, but we have to be careful, for both of our sakes. The following days were tense. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least not that I knew, but the weight of her suspicion loomed over me like a storm cloud. Alden tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then one evening, Victor came home earlier than expected. I was in the laundry room with Alden, the two of us standing much closer than we should have when we heard the front door creak open. We quickly separated, almost like guilty teenagers. Victor called my name, his voice echoing through the house. Here, I responded, my voice calm despite the rising panic in my chest. Victor appeared at the doorway, his gaze scanning the room. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he simply nodded. Dinner's nearly ready, I said quickly. He left without another word, but the look he gave me stayed with me long after he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment in the laundry room, the way Victor's gaze lingered on me just a second too long. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that sooner or later everything would collapse. But despite it all, I couldn't bring myself to end whatever was happening between Alden and me. It felt too powerful, too consuming to walk away from. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't finished. It had only just begun. It all started when Victor came home earlier than expected. But this time, it wasn't just the timing that threw me off. His face was tense, his expression unreadable as he walked into the house and set his briefcase down with a loud thud. Alden, Victor called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach churn. Alden appeared moments later, his relaxed posture a sharp contrast to Victor's tension. What's up? He asked, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets. Victor's eyes narrowed. We need to talk. Now, he commanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Alden briefly looked at me, concern flashing in his eyes before following Victor into the living room. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart racing. At first, I couldn't hear their words, just the low rumble of Victor's voice and Alden's occasional quieter responses. But as the conversation grew heated, the words became clearer. I know what's been going on, Victor said, his voice cold as ice. What are you talking about? Alden responded, his voice calm but guarded. Don't play dumb with me, Victor snapped. I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. Do you think I'm blind? My blood ran cold. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to confront Alden. Victor, you're imagining things, Alden replied, his voice more steady than I thought possible. There's nothing going on. Don't lie to me, Victor roared, and I heard the sound of something shattering, maybe a glass. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I stepped into the doorway, my hands trembling. Victor stopped. Both men turned to look at me, their expressions starkly different. Victor's was a mix of anger and betrayal, while Alden's bore more of a defiant edge. Melina, Victor said, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. Tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you two? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My silence was answer enough. Victor let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his thinning hair. I knew it, he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. Victor, please, I started, stepping closer, but he cut me off, raising his hand. Don't try to explain. There's nothing you can say to make this okay. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Victor turned to Alden, his eyes blazing. You're out, he said coldly. Pack your things and leave tonight. Alden stood firm, his jaw clenched. I'm not going anywhere. Yes, you are, Victor shot back. You're not staying under my roof, disrespecting me like this. I think you should calm down, Alden said, his voice low but firm, which only made Victor angrier. He stepped closer to Alden, fists clenched at his sides. Don't tell me to calm down, you little. Stop it, I shouted, stepping between them. Both of you, just stop. Victor turned to me, his eyes filled with hurt. How could you, Melina? He asked, his voice breaking. After everything I've done for you. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, tears streaming down my face. I never wanted to hurt you. Well, you did, he said bitterly, and now I have to live with the fact that my own wife and my son. He broke off, shaking his head. I can't even say it. Alden reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't bear his touch, not now, not with Victor watching. I think it's best if I leave, Alden said quietly. Victor stared at me, his expression hardening. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. This is my house. If anyone's leaving, it's him. Victor, I began, but he cut me off. No, he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. I don't want to hear it. You've made your choice, Melina, and now you're going to live with the consequences. Alden left that night. He packed a bag without saying a word, his movements stiff and mechanical. I followed him to the driveway, my heart breaking with each step. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He turned to me, his expression softer than I expected. This isn't over, he said, his voice steady. You know that, right? I nodded, but didn't speak, because as much as I wanted to believe him, I wasn't sure if it was true. As his car disappeared down the street, a deep ache settled in my chest, a mixture of guilt, loss, and something I couldn't quite place. The following days were unbearable. Victor barely spoke to me. His silence was more painful than any words could have been. I threw myself into household chores, desperate to keep myself busy, but nothing could distract me from the emptiness I felt. Then, a week later, the letter arrived. It was from Alden. No return address, just my name written in his familiar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I unfolded the paper. Melina, I know things are complicated right now, but I need you to know that I meant what I said. This isn't over. I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. I can't just walk away from you. I won't. When you're ready, I'll be waiting, always. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to tear it up, burn it, and pretend it had never existed. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit to, clung to his words like a lifeline. That night, I hid the letter in the back of my dresser drawer, keeping it like a secret I wasn't ready to share with anyone. Because deep down, I knew Alden was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.